let's dive straight in. So one of the key topics that we wanted to kick off with is the fact that Kubernetes has become the de facto standard for building modern cloud native applications that are out of the box, scalable and are resilient to failure, right? So Kubernetes has seen massive adoption over the course of the last few years and has become the de facto standard for building modern cloud native applications. An interesting trend that we're also seeing is the fact that Kubernetes is almost kind of being likened to what Linux was many years ago, which is just the abstraction layer for your underlying infrastructure. So Kubernetes is being positioned as almost a cloud operating system that allows you to build applications in a very declarative way and allow you to deploy those applications wherever, whether it's on-prem in your data center or in a public cloud provider.
And should we talk, Shafiq, a little bit about why Kubernetes is the one, why it's as I like your reference here, why it is the way, as they would say in The Mandalorian?
Yeah.
What made Kubernetes win?
Yeah, we can definitely talk a little bit about that. Dan, do you want to lead that off, and I can chime in? Yeah.
Well, I think you hit on some of it. I think that it was built to mimic some of the patterns that we saw at the hyperscalers that allowed them to build very scalable and very resilient applications. They realized that their lifeblood, their very business depended on that site, that app always being up. And so they had to come up with ways that were very resilient, that prevented human error, that prevented hardware error from taking down the site. And so this move to containers really started there, as they realized that if we say, hey, forget the server, no one ever deploys anything to a server. We're using containers. Those containers can be scaled effectively. They could be up. And Kubernetes really takes those patterns and makes them accessible to everybody. So I think that's one of the big reasons. You want to hit on another one or two?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the way, the deployment patterns for applications, what Kubernetes enables you to do is, I used the term declarative, a minute ago, right? So what I mean by that is you really don't need to have any human intervention when you're, deploying your applications. You simply define the resources that your application needs. Resiliency is factored in through maybe the use of like replicas, where you're able to deploy applications in a highly available fashion. And it's up to Kubernetes as the orchestration platform to ensure that your application stays online, right? So there really isn't any room for human error, or there really isn't any intervention needed as far as your application is concerned, right? Or maintenance of your application is concerned. And then past deployment, when it comes down to operations and when it comes down to like maintaining your applications, it's much more simpler to lifecycle manage applications leveraging Kubernetes APIs through automation, right? There are capabilities that exist within Kubernetes that allow you to deploy applications using, let's say, a rolling strategy, which really ensure that you're able to gracefully update versions of your applications without having to go through traditionally. Being in IT for many years, it's like, it's not your traditional maintenance windows you need to be worried about, right? We've had stories, of people adopting Kubernetes in production and making changes, significantly without having to like really factor in maintenance windows. Or one of the value propositions we talk to customers about, or operators about, is the fact that you really are not going to be spending the same amount of time on maintenance windows as far as application rollouts and deployments are concerned, right? It really challenges your developers to think about application deployment or modern software development lifecycle in a different way, right? And you're really getting all the goodness of just like you mentioned, the hyperscaler culture. It's something that could be adopted within your own enterprise.
And I want to hit on one other thing before we get on the next slide, and that is that, so we talked about why people adopt the technology, and of course it is portable because you can run Kubernetes anywhere. You move to the cloud, you can run it on premises, you can run it on any cloud. But I want to point out one thing which is really encapsulated in both of those bottom bullets, which is the innovation in app deployment, the innovation in operations, the innovation in developer experience is all around Kubernetes today. If you were to choose another platform, then you would be missing out on that innovation. And even if you look at what the major, I don't know, networking vendors, look what say F5, Cisco is doing, what Palo Alto Networks is doing, they are all innovating on top of Kubernetes now. And so if you want to be able to take advantage of what's happening in technology, you have to be in this space. So
Yeah.
Kubernetes is the way. I think we can agree.
No, completely right. And it's just, the ecosystem is just so rich, and there's just, vibrant from the perspective of all of the innovation that's going on in there, right? And you hit on networking. Just think of any other capability that you would use to build out a platform, right? Whether it's something that's, security related, or you're talking about integration with your existing storage fabrics, or integration with your existing network solutions that allow for layer 7 capabilities, right? All of these ISVs who are working in this ecosystem and unlocking all of these capabilities for customers are definitely ensuring that they do have a solution for Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is almost becoming that substrate to build your platform on, and deploy your applications on, just purely because there's just a lot of community engagement and a lot of where the innovation is happening, right?
So if I'm a CIO and I'm attending this webinar and I say, okay, great, like Shafiq convinced me we're going to Kubernetes, we're done. Should they sign off now?
Yeah.
Or should you get to the next slide?
Okay, all right. So yeah, that's a great lead in, right? And thanks for that, Dan. I was joking when I said yes, right? So Kubernetes by itself, again, Kubernetes by itself is just giving you the container orchestration capability, right? So we're seeing a lot of adoption of a mindset of building teams that are engineering platforms, right? So what constitutes a platform? Going back to my solution architect days and consulting days, it's always about building something that makes sense to the business, that's going to accelerate business outcomes for a specific organization, and almost just kind of being very laser focused about adopting innovation to really move the needle when it comes down to solving challenges for your organization, right? So that being said, if I'm looking to build a platform and I'm looking specifically to build a Kubernetes-based platform, Kubernetes just gives me this one capability, which is what we just talked about or discussed in the previous slide, which is robust, container orchestration, a resilient way to deploy your applications. In order to build a feature complete platform that allows you to really meet those requirements that your business might have, you need to start figuring out what some of the other capabilities you're going to also build alongside Kubernetes, right? So it could be something along the lines of figuring out how you integrate with storage, how you do secrets management, what your application deployment formats are going to look like. How do I provide my developers a service mesh technology? How do I handle networking, whether it's load balancing, or trying to figure out how I'm going to secure applications using certificates, or trying to ensure that all of the applications that I deploy have HTTPS encryption for their mode of communication. Or if my platform is going to be serving or providing resources to multiple teams, do I have robust multi-tenancy included, right? So it's not just about Kubernetes, it's much more complicated than that, because you really need to figure out how I'm going to unlock all of those additional capabilities. And those were just some examples, and they're by no means a complete list, but the idea is you really need to look at what's out there in the ecosystem and which vendors you're going to work with, whether it's a commercial vendor, or the graphic out here is the CNCF landscape, right? Which projects you're actually going to cherry pick and choose, because you have multiple options for each of these capabilities. I call them technologies that underpin a capability, right? So the concept here is you need to do a lot more work in building out that feature complete platform, or quote unquote a batteries included platform, when it comes down to Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, because as you said, Kubernetes is a container orchestration platform, right? That's what it does. And the reason the cloud native landscape is so complex is that there are many things you need for security, for all of those things you notice on top of it. So if, again, like, let me put myself in the shoes of that CIO, I'm saying, okay, so I have to settle on Kubernetes. And yes, I do need to secure everything. I might need to figure out, do I need MTLS? What do I need? Do I need smart, L7 load balancing? What am I going to do about secrets? Does that mean that, well, it seems like the decision to adopt Kubernetes was an easy one, but there's a lot more research in front of me, because I'm going to have to learn what each of these icons means, what's behind the project, what purpose is it filling? How does that fit with my requirements? And then choose each one. Is that what you're telling me? I've got another 6 or 9 months of work ahead of me to try and figure out how to turn this container orchestration platform into a real, enterprise-ready, cloud-native, smart cloud platform. Is that right?
Yeah,
it's going to cost me an extra 9 months.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like, right? That's typically the journey that you go on once you've decided to, go down the path of Kubernetes, right? So it's a significant amount of research, and yeah, it takes a significant amount of investment from a people time perspective to figure out what your end state technical stack looks like.
Okay, but let's say I do that, right? So
Yeah.
so I put in that 9 months. Then am I ready? Then can I just turn my application developers loose where my operations people were set?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, or my lead in was going to be, great, we've figured out now, hopefully you're along for the journey, right? The story that we're trying to paint here. So we've figured out the technical stack. We've made our choices. We've decided that the business needs a platform with all of these capabilities. We've picked all of these different technologies to underpin those specific capabilities. Does it end there? That's just your day one. What happens after, right, is the question, right? Significant operational challenges ahead, right? And what do we mean by that, right? Installation, great. You've got one stack ready to go. What if you get massive success and everybody wants in on the platform, and you decide to roll out this technical stack to multiple geographies, for example, right? We deal largely distributed world nowadays, and we really want to provide the same experience, or a consistent experience across your organization, across multiple geos. So there is still a challenge associated with, have you figured out the automation, or just generally the installation aspect of how you're going to manage this technical stack?
Right. And I think it's important to note that you've got not just one thing, as you just said, we've got Kubernetes, and many of those things run on top of Kubernetes. Some of those things are running underneath Kubernetes, right? You're now, and each of those projects has its own release cycle. So this process itself is going to be significant, right? As you say, it's going to be significant every time you turn something up, every time you turn up a new new data center, new region, even a new cluster. But now you've got all these different components with dependencies between them, possibly reliance on each other, and they each have their own life cycle, right? Upgrade, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And upgrades, that's another key part of it, right? So if day one signifies just getting your technical stack up and running based on the design that you put together, what does subsequent days look like, or what does post day one look like? Let's say a quarter down the road, you decide, I really need a specific capability that one of these projects is getting me. What is your upgrade strategy going to look like? And then it's not just for a single cluster, because you were so successful and you saw massive, or you've seen massive adoption with your platform that you've just built. You need to figure out how you're going to roll out, or what your upgrade strategy is going to look like globally for all of the clusters that you have running in production, right? So upgrade is a key aspect. Dan alluded to the whole interoperability bit, right? So now we all know the benefits of leveraging open source, but then just like Dan mentioned, each of these projects, there really isn't any synchronization when it comes down to the release cycles, or whether someone's you really need to be meticulous about going through documentation and figuring out whether a specific project, or a specific technical capability is compatible with maybe the underlying version of Kubernetes that you're running on. Breaking changes happen, right? That's something that we've seen often as operators or someone who's been in IT for a while. That breaking changes happen, and just reading the fine print and just ensuring that you're managing all of those moving pieces from an interoperability perspective is another key challenge from an operational perspective. And last but not least, security, right? We are dealing with complex, distributed systems. Kubernetes by itself is a distributed system with multiple moving parts. Then we haven't even started talking about the workloads, right? So it depends on the workloads that you deploy in the platform. What is your strategy to secure, the workloads, the platform itself, and then the workloads that run on the platform? So
I think one important thing is, you said the workloads are your business and you're going to have to, you got to figure that out. But the platform, I think that's a really important thing, right? We just showed that open source landscape, and you're going to need 2 dozen of those projects at least, right? You're going to become very acquainted with the letters CVE, common vulnerability exposure, right?
yep.
And each of those will have to be something that you are paying attention to, because when some of these CVEs come out, they will affect you, and they will affect you might think you're in control of your upgrade and your interoperability, and then all of a sudden you've got to patch a component that you didn't know you were going to have to patch, right? Again, aside from your own code, you're reliant on open source project and open source project. So security becomes a very important operational challenge that you have to solve, right?
Yep. And this is what leaders and architects and everyone working in this ecosystem are constantly thinking about, right? How do I, the term that's being floated nowadays is reducing the cognitive load associated with operations, right? Just making it simple. It's about figuring out how I can minimize the amount of time that I'm spending on operations. All right, so I've solved that then, right? Or I have a strategy, or I work with somebody to figure out how I reduce my cycles or my team cycles spent on operations. What's next? What's next in the journey?
So I think that the thing that we have to bear in mind as we're doing this, as we're thinking about adopting Kubernetes, we're adopting this new technology. One thing to understand is that you have to solve this in a way that you've solved it in more than one place. I think there was, and I spent a lot of time working at Google Cloud, and when we spent a lot of time, and with the other vendors as well, trying to get people to move to the cloud, thinking eventually it's all going to run up there, right? Eventually people are going to choose a cloud, they're going to move everything up there. But what we're seeing increasingly, and what every attendee of this call is seeing, is that it's never going to be 100% in the cloud. And in fact, CIOs are saying, and CTOs are saying, no. Hybrid cloud isn't a waypoint along the destination. Hybrid cloud is where we're going to end up. So as you're choosing your Kubernetes solution, unless you want to double your work, double your operations staff, increase their, I love that term, their cognitive load, you are going to have to solve it in a way that it solves both for what you run in the cloud and on-prem. And chances are it's not just one cloud, right?
Yeah, chances are it's not just one cloud. It's a lot of organizations, even if they do not start off directly with a multi-cloud strategy, they definitely want a hybrid cloud strategy, which is a combination of their own private data centers with a primary cloud provider, right? And that's a significant, that tends to be a significant investment that they're definitely exploring. So what do you think are some of the common use cases for multi-cloud management? This is a conversation I love having, and maybe I'll throw in a couple of those use cases. So outside of you mentioned that everyone's looking at a multi-cloud strategy or a hybrid cloud strategy because the data is not going to move, right? So the data gravity or governance requirements might dictate a multi-cloud strategy or a hybrid cloud strategy. What else are we thinking here?
Well, if your company is big enough, if you're working at a Fortune 2000 company, one of the reasons is that one of the ways you got to be a Fortune 2000 companies was through acquisitions. You're acquiring companies and they're already deployed somewhere, and they might be deployed somewhere in such a way that it's very difficult or expensive for them to move. They might be dependent on services. They're absolutely there. Other companies refuse to be dependent on single vendors. Absolutely. In financial services, I would hear about the 4 cloud strategy, and the 4 cloud strategy is the 3 major players plus our own. And they were all very, very clear that they, sometimes for bargaining reasons, sometimes for resilience reasons, and just not wanting to be dependent on a single company, they wanted to ensure that they could always choose. So that there are a bunch of reasons. Sometimes you're running a workload that someone really does have a proprietary technology running in their cloud, and it makes sense for you to run a workload near that technology.
Yeah, a couple of other common use cases that I've come across is just it could be as simple as just business continuity or DR, right? We've definitely seen a disaster recovery, right? So it's just all about leveraging multiple cloud providers just to ensure that your business is not impacted in the event of an outage, right? So that's one common strategy. The other one is with the rise of just having a distributed world that we live in today is just all about, what I call the POP architecture, right? Which is a point of presence, right? It's just about having, your services running as close to your user as possible, right? Or your end users as possible. So the idea of just having that point of presence, in a global world, in a world that's, increasingly getting digitized, that makes a lot of sense, right? So you definitely want to have multiple cloud providers. Certain cloud providers might not have the regions that in a market that you're potentially looking to tap into. So that's another great use case as well. So the headline
are we gonna both transition here? You go ahead, you transition.
Yeah. All right, so we discussed a little bit about multi-cloud, and we talked about why multi-cloud is a challenge a little bit. We touched on that. The reason we are kind of like transitioning to this slide is we want to talk about what it really looks like at the deployment level, right? When you decided that, okay, multi-cloud or hybrid cloud is something that you really want to do, what are some of the challenges associated with actually getting that working, right? So that's
Kubernetes is open source, right? Didn't we already choose open when we chose Kubernetes? I don't understand.
Yeah, we did. That's the aspect, right? That's the aspect that we want to really talk about here. Kubernetes is supposed to be open source. So, are we connecting the dots? Yes, we are, right? So, we really want to be able to use a Kubernetes-based solution in order to help with some of those challenges that really are tied to, let's say, a multi-cloud strategy, right? So the first pillar being here, let's talk about portability. Especially when you decide to go hybrid cloud, the idea here, we're trying to tie a couple of concepts here, where if the objective is to have a hybrid cloud strategy, and then as a CIO, I want to reduce the time spent on operations. I really don't want to have multiple, modes of operation when it comes down to maintaining, my platform in a private data center or in one of the cloud providers, and, have a different experience all over the place, right? The idea about, leveraging Kubernetes to do this is the fact that you have the portability of just having a unified experience across any infrastructure that you might be leveraging in order to build out this multi-cloud strategy or hybrid cloud strategy that you're looking for. Does that help, Dan?
I think it does, and I think there's more too, because I think that Kubernetes is absolutely open source, and there are lots of vendors who will package a Kubernetes into a essentially a platform for you, but they don't all really allow pluggability at every layer. Right? There are some that say, oh, you can use Kubernetes, but you have to use it on our operating system, for example. Yeah. Or we've got a monitoring system built in, and we don't allow you to plug that in. And one of the beauties of Kubernetes, and one of the reasons that Kubernetes won, is that not just that it was open source, but that it had pluggability everywhere, right? If you look at service mesh, I used to work on the Istio project, right? There's probably 4 service meshes in the cloud native landscape. So when you're choosing Kubernetes done right, when you're building not just Kubernetes, but that platform, and you're choosing a platform to build on, you want to ensure that your platform allows you to plug in what you want to plug in, right? And I think that that's really important because you are cutting yourself off from some of the innovation in this cloud native landscape. If you're building a platform that when something innovative happens, you can't plug it in. Your vendor says, oh, no, we don't allow you to do that. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's not so that's the key difference here, right? It's not a PaaS, right? A PaaS is a very opinionated way of doing things. The philosophy, the ethos behind building a platform leveraging Kubernetes is the whole pluggability aspect, right? We have conversations all the time with folks who have like certain opinions on how a capability is delivered. Like let me give you an example. When we're talking about logging, for example, right? So there are a bunch of solutions out there, or there might be an enterprise standard that says this is how you have to do logging, right? And they're for very good reasons. It could be for audit purposes, or it could be for just ensuring that you're able to figure out forensic information based on access to your applications or data. So there are very good reasons why enterprise standards exist for a specific capability, and you really want to like be able to have a platform that can readily plug into those standards or plug into those specific requirements or meet those requirements, right? And that's a pretty exciting thing about Kubernetes and building out a platform that is based on Kubernetes. You just have the pluggability aspect. And Dan touched on this a little bit, the innovative aspect or the innovation aspect, right? There's always something innovative going on as far as the Kubernetes ecosystem is concerned. Everyone likes talking about the service mesh, and Dan touched on that a little bit, but it's very exciting, for developers, because a service mesh allows you to, not really impose limitations on your developers, right? So it's a polyglot world where, developers have their preference for, what they're developing in, and you really want to like decouple some of the non-functional capabilities from your application code, right? So if you're looking at building a capability that's, Dan referred to mutual TLS, just ensuring that the applications communicate in a secure way, or you really want to like implement a circuit breaker pattern just to ensure that you're able to like, meet certain SLOs, or, cut off traffic when, there's an incident, those are capabilities that a service mesh brings to the table. And that's just one example of like some of the innovation that's going on in the ecosystem, right?
Okay, so I'm going to devil's advocate again. All the cloud providers now have managed Kubernetes. Again, if I'm that CIO, CTO, can I just take that managed Kubernetes and assume that that's okay, right? It's all managed for me. Doesn't that solve this problem?
Not really. And we'll talk about why, right? So the question here is, all the cloud providers, or is managed Kubernetes a solution, right? Everyone's got a managed Kubernetes solution now. It only solves part of the problem, right? So going back a few years, typically when you were getting started in this cloud native journey that hopefully we've been doing a current job of just kind of taking you on, you start off with like figuring out what makes sense to me from a technology perspective. You land on Kubernetes, you understand that this is the future, this is how I want to develop my applications. I want to really get away from the business of managing servers. I want to abstract my underlying infrastructure and provide my developers a great experience. All right, fantastic. But then, there was a period of struggle where, customers typically, or, folks working with Kubernetes, they go through a bunch of challenges when it comes down to like, figuring out how to run this in production, right? That enter the cloud managed, Kubernetes services, right? They really abstract away some of the really hard parts of operating Kubernetes in production, right? Like, for example, the common, punchline of the tagline, Dan, like a few years ago was, oh man, I'm just so worried because I have to operate etcd in production, right? Or, I'm troubleshooting problems with the raft protocol, or just trying to like figure out what's going on here. Why did I lose my cluster, right? So that's a challenge the managed Kubernetes services definitely solve for, right? They make that aspect of operating Kubernetes, or that component of Kubernetes, which is the central nervous system, almost a black box, right? So the idea is you focus on figuring out what your business outcomes are, figuring out the other aspects of the design that you need to be spending your time on as far as the platform is concerned, right? Choosing the appropriate instances of which machine types that you need in order to support your workloads, and figuring out the other things that we just spent the last few minutes talking about, which was building out the rest of the stack. Dan, was that?
Right. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. Your managed Kubernetes are fantastic offerings. I think the best advertisement they ever got was Kubernetes the hard way by Kelsey Hightower, right? Because it showed installing, running Kubernetes is tough. You can get Kubernetes out of the box from any of the cloud vendors and never have to worry about any of that aspect again. But those limitations that we talked about, Kubernetes at its heart really is container orchestration. You still need to layer in all those pieces. And while different cloud vendors have done different things to make that a little bit easier, for the most part, it is not a platform out of the box. And you still need to put a lot of pieces in place on top of it to take that managed Kubernetes into a complete, integrated, automated platform. And now is when you get to talk about why D2IQ and something like AWS EKS are better together.
Yeah, so we're gonna use our friends and our partners at AWS as an example here, and EKS is a great distribution as far as great cloud managed Kubernetes service that you can run in production. But then, just like Dan mentioned, at the end of the day, it's still Kubernetes, and you still need to spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out how you're going to build out this feature complete platform, right? So there are a couple of patterns that we've seen, how customers or folks working in this domain try to solve for this problem, right? One is a pure do-it-yourself approach. So great, it's a scenario that I described, right? I really want to make the operations related to Kubernetes simple, so I'm going to go with EKS. But then I decide to curate the rest of my technical stack using open source components, perhaps borrowed from the CNCF landscape, right? So then we are back to the same problem, right? What are we doing for figuring out a strategy that's going to allow you to consistently install these on multiple clusters? Then it becomes challenges related to upgrades. It goes back to interoperability challenges. It goes back to security challenges, right? So it's that circle that we had earlier in the presentation. So that's the first approach. You're using EKS plus just completely doing it yourself as far as the rest of the capabilities are concerned. The second approach that we've seen is obviously the cloud vendors have managed services that unlock some of these capabilities, right? So for example, staying within the AWS ecosystem, you might have CloudWatch for your logging and metrics. There is a solution available for maybe continuous deployment on Kubernetes. You could decide to stitch all of those together and integrate all of them with EKS to get that feature complete platform that you need, right? But then obviously you're going to be if your CFO is watching, you really need to be on point in terms of just understanding what costs all of these represent, and just be able to build out the appropriate cost model just to ensure that it meets your business requirements, or if you have specific TCO or ROI targets, you really need to be cognizant of the fact that each of these services costs their own money, right? And then
and you need to be aware of costs. I mean, you need to be aware of portability, right? Because if you're dependent on a cloud service, and you need to run your, you're in that hybrid cloud world or that multi-cloud world, that means now you're using different services, right? And one thing we haven't talked about very much is that there are many use cases, including on-prem and in the cloud, but on-prem especially, where you need to run an air-gapped cluster, and you can't use a cloud-based solution for any of these in those cases. So I think, yeah, the point here is a great one, that the managed Kubernetes services are fantastic. And when you're in the cloud, they're a really good way to get Kubernetes. Be aware that everything else that you need to do in terms of security, in terms of networking, in terms of backup, in terms of, by the way, incomplete list here, is still something that needs to be done on top of those. And you need to solve those problems, and you want to solve those consistently organization-wide, so you don't have individual teams solving them in individual ways, especially differently in individual clouds and on-prem locations.
Exactly, a unified operational experience, right? We touched upon that a little bit, earlier in the presentation, right? You really want to have a consistent experience, especially if you're, trying to tackle a hybrid cloud deployment or a multi-cloud, strategy. You really want to strive for having a unified experience, irrespective of what your, underlying infrastructure looks like, right? Whether it's on-prem with bare metal, Dan mentioned, air gap, right? If you have workloads that are running in your private data center, are you going to, something to think about is, are you going to have a different operating model when it comes down to like, versus what you have in the cloud? And then the third approach that I was going to touch on a little bit is the fact that the cloud vendors, obviously being very customer first, they are working towards like enabling some of these capabilities, with EKS, right? So we definitely want to acknowledge that. And, that is something that's gathering ahead of steam. Again, it more or less aligns with what the challenges are as far as the second scenario is concerned, which is you end up you lose a little bit of portability there, just purely because you're using opinionated tooling, which will just work in a specific cloud vendor's ecosystem. And it's really not something that you could just kind of pick up and use when you decide to like either move your workloads back on-prem, or you decide to leverage a different cloud provider for whatever reason, right? So the loss of portability is pretty key there as well. So the graphic on the right, what it's just meant to articulate is with D2IQ's Kubernetes platform with EKS. It's a complete integrated, turnkey solution using open source technology that allows you to like, standardize your experience across any infrastructure. That's the key takeaway here. All right.
All right. Should we kind of wrap up the technology portion? Yeah.
Yeah.
So sum it up for me. How do you do Kubernetes right?
Yeah. let's put it all together. Let's put it all together, right? So this is a key takeaway here, right? Committing to open source, we really, again, we harped on the open source aspect of, the benefits of open source and why, portability matters. We really want to get to a point where there is standardization of operations, right? And you really want to start looking at clusters themselves as cattle, right? The initial concept of like cloud native, back in the day, people talked about, cattle versus pets, right? And now it's gone to a point where you can significantly automate your operations, where you can start looking at your Kubernetes clusters themselves as cattle, right? So how do you do that? Is through the use of GitOps and declarative APIs, just like you would deploy workloads on Kubernetes using deployments. Adopt a mindset that just allows you to declare the state of a Kubernetes cluster and get up and running really quick without any human intervention. You really don't want to be running scripts all over the place and using something that's really custom and run into like operational challenges every time you decide to either stand up a new deployment or upgrade existing Kubernetes.
I can't emphasize that enough. I was at I know a company that was looking at opening a new region, and they were budgeting a quarter to open up their new region. And the reason is that bottom. It's all run by humans. Yes, there's scripted stuff. They've automated some things, but they are literally, it's going to take months to ensure everything is installed in that region. The clusters are created properly. They were running some Kubernetes and some VMs, but that's not the way you want to be. When it's time to turn up another cluster somewhere, that should be as simple as a change in a config file, and everything else happens. Everything else, every bit in that stack, from the deployment of Kubernetes, whether it's a managed Kubernetes or not, to everything else that happens, should be declarative. And opening up that new region, or falling over to it, it might just be a new availability zone, right? It doesn't have to be you're opening a new region. Should be done in that way.
Yeah, exactly. And the power
and then
Go
And then I
ahead.
was gonna say, and make sure that you're ready for your deployment patterns, right? You might have some things that need to run in a particular place. You might have some things that need to run on-prem. Understand those going in. So as you're choosing your solutions, they will work there. If you have a reason to run air-gapped clusters, whether on-prem or in the cloud or in a moving vehicle, for example, make sure that you're choosing a solution that's going to work in those different deployment patterns.
Yeah, exactly. Work your way backwards from, what your business needs, right? That's kind of like my line, just working, do not make, decisions that are really not going to serve your organization's, purpose, right? So figure out like if it's an on-prem strategy that you need, or if there for specific reasons you need to have an air gap deployment, or you're deploying a platform to the edge. We've seen some pretty cool, use cases where you want to move the compute, towards the edge, where the data is, right? And you can definitely enable, or you can use Kubernetes to build a platform that enables that deployment pattern, right? So I think we find that like pretty exciting. It definitely lends itself to enabling really cool use cases, going forward, right? I made this comment earlier. The world is, increasingly app centric and getting digitized, and people want to build applications that unlock new streams of revenue, or whether it's just engaging new customers, or like figuring out ways to optimize on how experiences for your end users might look like, right? And all these lend themselves to like different deployment patterns. And we think a Kubernetes based platform, obviously done right, is a way of definitely tackling those business challenges, right? And then
Okay, hold on, being cognizant of time, I think we should say,
yeah,
okay, so this is how you do it right from a technology perspective.
yeah,
But I know that there's one last point you want to hit, and that is it just technology?
it's not just technology, right? So this is, for folks who've worked with me in the past, it's like they always say, for me, success is a function of people, process, and technology, right? So while we spent the lion's share of this presentation, just talking about, the technology challenges, or how we solve for some of these technical problems. Be cognizant of the fact that we really need to involve people, and build the appropriate processes in order to be successful as well. So, this graphic again just talks about, some of the common, user challenges that, organizations grapple with in order to like, get this right. So some of this includes, just making some of these cultural changes, right? In order to have a DevOps mindset, or start building a, practice around, GitOps, you need to have transparency and collaboration, right? So highly siloed organizations, where think of it as, development teams not talking to the operational teams, or vice versa. That really doesn't, really lend itself, or like put you in a position where you're going to be successful with this initiative that you're taking on, right? So
I think that that's the most interesting thing here, is that
yeah,
when you ask users what their challenges is, number one is culture,
yeah,
right? Number one isn't a technology, and this is what you ask the people, the issues. And if we go look at the organizational challenges on the next slide, I think you see something else very interesting, which is when you ask organizations, what's the biggest problem for you adopting Kubernetes? Look over there, monitoring health and performance of Kubernetes clusters. Seems like that'd be important. It's relatively small. More important is the thing we all hear about, is how do I refactor my monolith to actually run in Kubernetes? But even that, more important than that, is the thing that Shafiq, we've talked a lot about today, which is how do you manage Kubernetes itself and that ecosystem, all the components? But the most important thing is the people, right? The number one challenge people are having. And what I find that's interesting in this, 2/3 of people say their biggest problem with cloud native is finding, attracting, and retaining qualified Kubernetes talent. My opinion, Shafiq, is they're looking at this the wrong way. That you can't look at how do we hire all new people who understand Kubernetes. I think that the lesson that I'm hoping that CIOs, CTOs, our CEOs are learning here is that we've got to bring our people along. We've got to give our people the practices, the tools, the training, what they need to adopt to this new world. Because if you're going to be trying to replace all of your developers, all of your operators, you're going to fall farther behind.
yeah, exactly. Invest in your people. There's great training available from an operator, persona perspective. There's great training that, allows developers to, adopt a cloud native mindset and leverage, Kubernetes effectively, right? So that's definitely, part of the solution, right?
Which will segue you perfectly into, hey, look at that.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's all about, people, process, and technology, right? It's about organizing for success. The making the cultural changes are probably the hardest, right? But that's something that you definitely have to take a look at, if you really want to become, a DevOps or GitOps, process based organization. Changing your organization to reflect that is something that needs to happen, right? Training and enablement is key. If you don't have, the cycles, or, you are struggling to really get your enablement programs or your cultural change programs off the ground, engage with an expert, or, just figure out if there's a vendor out there that can, help you with your journey, right? And, they can come to the table, give you the best practices, known practices, and, that way accelerate your journey to cloud native maturity, right?
Yep.
All right, that's it. So this is going to be the real final slide here, right? Which is just tying all of this together. So what do we mean by doing Kubernetes right? Adopt a complete platform, right? So Kubernetes is just Kubernetes. If you're looking to build a feature complete platform, there's a lot more that you need to think about. Keep it open, leverage open source. It gives you the benefits of all the innovation that's going on in the ecosystem, gives you the portability associated with using open source technology, but there is a significant amount of innovation in the automation space as well, which just allows you to really treat the platforms or your clusters as cattle, right? Declare everything, allow the automation to do its work, right? And hybrid and multi-cloud is the destination. A lot of common deployment patterns nowadays are hybrid and multi-cloud in nature. Again, it all comes down to what your business needs, and it's just not about the technology. So think people, process, and technology.